Welcome everyone, good afternoon. My name is Veerle van den Eynden, and as Mark said, I work for the UK Data Service at the University of Essex. The UK Data Service is a data center and data support service funded by the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, specifically for social sciences data. I manage the group that handles research data management within the archive, which means that we provide advice, support and training to researchers whilst they're doing their research on good practices to make sure that their data can be made shareable, and we also then oversee the deposit of those data into our repository ReShare, of which I'll tell more later.
Good afternoon everyone, my name's Rick Stuart, as you've heard, and I coordinate the support from the Environmental Information Data Centre to researchers, and similarly we work with the research groups to look at the best ways that the data can be managed and deposited with the data centres, because we recognise that there's always things that need to be taken into account. There's no one size fits all, so that's very much part of our work, very much part of Veerle's work as well. So what I'm going to do is to continue this webinar now and take you through some slides which show how the data centres are there to support you, what they can do to support you with the expectations upon yourselves, and the benefits to yourselves of doing this, because there are a lot of benefits to the individual researchers who generate the data. So we can talk you through those. And then obviously the important part is to tell you, okay, what are the practical steps? What is it you need to do next? Okay, so as Mark was saying, there are a number of NERC data centres, and they're generally discipline specific, although there's no hard and fast rules. As I said, we always look at each individual circumstance and decide what is the most appropriate data centre for the data to be deposited with. Myself, as I say, I work for EIDC, and we look after the kind of terrestrial freshwater sciences hydrology community data, although there are overlaps, so we'll come on to that a bit later. And Veerle obviously is representing the UK Data Service, and we've both got over 40 years worth of, the data centres have got over 40 years worth of experience of managing nationally important data sets in the long term, and we're, between us, we're both providing that support and guidance and that long-term curation of data. So the benefits to yourselves, really, data are a science output and need to be recognised as such, and therefore are valuable. And our job is to help you make those data sets as outputs and valued outputs in themselves. And one of the ways we can do that is by giving digital object identifiers, which help provide a mechanism for proper citation of those data sets and the authors and the people that generated those data, which again allows people to perhaps produce publications around the data sets themselves, not just around the science, but also around the actual data sets. And we'll talk a little bit later about data papers as publications around describing the data rather than just the actual data being published in itself. One of the main benefits, of course, is that we provide the effort and the work into looking after those data sets to make sure that they are safely and securely stored, that they don't get changed or anything. They're preserved in integrity, and to make sure they're sort of coordinated with other data sets, well managed, well documented, and meet certain standards, so they're discoverable very easily across the web and are accessed under the appropriate conditions. We deal, as Mark was saying, we deal with the legislative arena as well. So freedom of information requests or EIR requests, we deal with those for you, and we make sure if the embargoes are in place, those are documented, because those will actually help fall within the legislation. Part of, obviously, as I say, making those data sets discoverable across the web is that actually helps promote the visibility of the research and the outputs themselves, because they're easily discoverable within the catalogue records. You can put links to the science itself, the publications, the program, the ESPA program, and therefore that helps to generally raise the profile of the research as well as the outputs themselves. So it's another tool in terms of promotion of your outputs. Similarly with the legal aspects, we'll deal with any queries from members of the public or other researchers. We may often have to pass those on, but normally we'll be able to deal with most of those because we hold all the supporting documentation as well as the data set themselves. And of course we can feed back information to you as the originators of the data, which may again help you in terms of impacts and things like this. So how many times has the data set been downloaded, etc., those kind of metrics. So there are a wide range of benefits to yourselves for actually sharing the data that you put a lot of hard work and effort into generating. So obviously, one of the questions is, well, what data? All the data, or just a part of it? So what we're really talking about, as Mark was identifying earlier, was the data that are unique and not easily regenerated. Those, are the long-term assets that are what we're talking about. It's usually base data or raw data, the sort of starting point of your research, of the audit trail, the sort of what's often called the raw data, the raw fuel, where that's practical. In some cases, it may be huge. Satellite information, for example, it's often not practical to store the raw data, but it's a compromise somewhere around the starting point. So that's kind of the kind of data we're talking about. Not everything you've ever generated, just the kind of raw start, and then you can always go back and restart again. Any data that underpins publication, Mark was highlighting that publishers of research journals now are wanting to have the data that underpins those publications accessible, and therefore that is considered data of long-term value. Any data that really you consider of future research use or teaching use or learning use, and again, there's no hard and fast rules. If you consider it to be that, then we'll have a discussion, and if we agree with you, then that's considered long-term value. Any data that informs policy, and probably the bottom line is data that can actually be made accessible. Ourselves in the NERC data centres, we have a sort of freely available one access policy, which is sort of open access, providing you sign up to the license agreement, whereas Veerle will tell you a little bit more in a few slides time around the way that the access constraints can be put on to protect certain levels of data, but it has to be being able to be made accessible in some form or other, or else it's not really worth keeping in the long term. There's more detail on those with the two links in this slide, which will be available after this webinar, so you can have a look at the further details there. So the kind of data that we take in, we're going to give you some examples here of the kind of data that will come to EIDC and the kind of data that will go to UKDS. But before I do that, it's worth highlighting, though, that there are other repositories that we may actually consider more appropriate given the circumstances. And one of those good examples is with sort of sequence data, DNA sequence data, omic kind of data, where we would actually point you in the direction of one of the very specialist repositories around that, because it's very specialist. But otherwise, the kind of examples from EIDC, we take in the kind of data like soil characteristics, observations of counts of species of butterflies in transects, or biomass per area, rainfall observations, or maps of from scenario models or from observations in the field around areas or features. So we'll take that kind of terrestrial freshwater observational data, but we can also take open access surveys or transcripts of interviews or participatory mapping, which falls sort of somewhere between the socioeconomic and the terrestrial side, and providing there's no issues with open access, and maybe you've already deposited some terrestrial data with us, then we can take that, and that's the kind of overlap. So Veerle is going to explain a little bit more now about the kind of data that UKDS take.
Thank you, Rick. So yes, UKDS focus specifically on social sciences data, socioeconomic data, and we do have the option to provide different levels of access to data, which means that we can also hold and disseminate and make available for reuse data that may contain identifying information, that may contain sensitive information, and you'll hear more about those access regulations as well. So the typical type of data that we get, whilst it might be surveys, household surveys, interviews, focus groups, it also includes audiovisual data, video diaries, participant observation, etc. So what is required from you as a researcher then in submitting data to EIDC or UKDS? Obviously, it's your responsibility as a researcher to make sure that the data are complete, correct, validated, and of high quality. Paying attention to the format. Whilst you do your research, you gather and analyze your data in a certain format. When it comes to an archive, we want to make sure that that format has got a certain long-term validity. So non-proprietary standardized format is what we tend to work with: CSV, text, SPSS, portable, etc. It's important that your data can be understood by other researchers, because that's ultimately the aim, that the data can be used in future for future research. So that requires documentation. This documentation is both at the level of the data set. It creates a catalog record that makes sure that your data can be found in our collections. It provides information on the context of your research, the methodology you used, etc. But it also goes down to the level of the data items itself, variables, etc. need to be described. Access is important, and that is done through license conditions. So the data need to be made accessible, and that is then described in those license conditions. Now, for example, in the case of data that results from human participants, as I indicated in the case of UK Data Service, we have different access options. The access options that we apply, data can be open access, data can be what we call safeguarded, and data can be what we call permission access. The difference there is that the safeguarded data are made available to users that are registered with the UK Data Service, and they have to sign a use agreement before they can download the data. And that use agreement really stipulates what the conditions of use are. And for example, one of those conditions is you can use the data to do research, but you can't use those data to go and identify participants that contributed information to that data set. That's a very important aspect for us. Permission access is one level up. That is where the data contains sensitive information that is impossible to anonymize. That is very typical the case for qualitative data, interviews, field notes, participant observations. When you try to anonymize those types of data, they might become impossible to reuse in future, because you would have to remove too much information for the data file. We place them as closed access collections, and the data owner, who is the researcher who placed those data with us, needs to give permission on a one-by-one basis whether those data can be released by us or not. So we still take responsibility for the long-term preservation and for making them accessible to users, but the user first has to request access from the data owner explaining the purpose of the use, and only then would those data be used. So that explains then that last sentence, where whilst in the case of EIDC, the data should not contain sensitive or identifying information, for UK Data Service that is possible. We can make those available. How do you then prepare your data for deposit? And first, let me again emphasize that both EIDC and UK Data Service, we work with researchers all the time in providing data management guidance. We have a lot of information on our website on how to manage your data, prepare them, document them. In the case of UKDS, we have a lot of information on our website on how to anonymize data, how to negotiate consent with participants for data sharing, etc. So please do go and consult that guidance, or come and ask us. So in practice, preparing data for deposit means paying attention to file names is important, checking that the data are complete, Paying attention to that documentation, so have you got clear labels for your files, variables, codes? Have you anonymized them sufficiently? If you have data sets that contain numerous data files, for example, transcripts from interviews, bundle them up into meaningful zip bundles that again have got meaningful names, so it's easy for the person downloading those data to understand what the data mean. Pay attention to the format. We provide best file formats information on our website. EIDC will consult with you on the format that they would like to receive data in. And in the case of UKDS, because we follow a process whereby the researcher, him or herself, uploads those data into our ReShare repository, we require a README file to be created for the data set. And there's more detailed guidance available on all that. Documentation then needs to be prepared as well that will accompany the data set so it can be understood. Now a lot of that documentation that explains the data will probably be in your publications, in your reports, so we can simply link to those. If that is not sufficient, then some descriptive information on the methodology used to collect the data, sampling, size, sampling mechanisms, the fieldwork protocols, instructions that were given to interviewers, question lists that were used for interviews, the questionnaire form that was used, etc. All that provides essential information for the users of your data file. In our case, we also want to see a copy of the consent form you used to double check that you've got permission to indeed share those data, make them available for reuse in the future. And as already said, that's a README file. Our process for receiving research data such as will be the case for ESPA data files is that those are deposited by the researcher into our ReShare repository. Again, it's a process that we guide researchers with. It's been in development for many years, and we think it's quite a smooth process for researchers to upload their data into the research system. So you create an account with us, you log in, you describe the metadata for your data collection. We can retrieve information from existing sources such as the UK Gateway to Research, so that some of those metadata will be pre-populated. You then upload your data and documentation files, and at that stage you set the access and the license conditions for each of those data files. Documentation files we typically make open access because that is important for users to be able to assess whether the data collection might be suitable for reuse. You then submit that collection to us and we carry out a review. That review process is typically to assess the quality of the documentation, to check that the formats are correct, but very importantly, we carry out disclosure checks. So we check that there's no identifying information in your data file that shouldn't be there. We check whether there's sensitive information in there. And at that stage, we can still negotiate with you what would be the best access option for those data that you've submitted with us. So that can be decided by you as a researcher, or we can advise you on what we think would be the best access option. We want to make sure that all the data we make available do not breach any data protection, and also would not breach any ethical agreement that you've made with research participants. Only when we're happy with all that, then we do proceed and publish those data.
Okay, I'm going to now talk you through a mirrored slide about how that happens with EIDC in terms of the deposit process. Normally the starting point is to contact EIDC either through some of the liaison staff that you may already be in contact with or know about, or just through our EIDC help desk email address, which will be in the slides later. The main thing we do is really start the process going by a discussion and around discussing the details, because we deal with such a variety of data from very, very different disciplines, and we have to try and make the best decision based on that situation, which sounds a little bit sort of labour intensive, but actually in the long run it's a lot better because we know that there is no one size approach. So we have a discussion with you, we talk about what you've got, whether it's best to deposit it as one data set or two or three. We agree all the details, including the access conditions, whether or not an embargo is required, things like this. We do all of this before anything is handed over, so everyone's very clear about what will happen. And obviously that helps to clear up you know, things in your own mind, things that we're not sure about in terms of what you're giving us, and therefore everyone's very confident about what's going to happen further down the line. Once that's been done, we've agreed everything, then you've got a bit of time to just prepare any data, i.e. change the format if you need to, and bring the documentation together. Normally you've got the documentation, it maybe just needs collating into a certain document. It's sort of pulled from others that you probably already got. Then you can just hand it over to us via a few different mechanisms. And then we pretty much do the rest. We create the online catalogue record from the documents you've given us. We set up all the services as we've agreed. And I'll just come on to some of those. So, and this is a fairly generic slide for both ourselves and UKDS. Obviously, once you've given us the data, you know, we look after it securely. That's what you're after. You want to make sure that, you know, we're not going to lose it or change it or anything. So obviously very securely stored data. It's catalogued into web discoverable catalogues that meet international standards. And we can provide a DOI once we've been handed the data. We can't give out DOIs before we've got the data, but once we've got them, we can give you a DOI. And the data doesn't have to actually be available for us to give you a DOI. I'll come on to that under managed access. So one thing that we would do at a fairly high level, but UKDS would do it a little bit more detail, is just checking for disclosure, the disclosure risk. You know, in other words, you know, are human subjects identifiable from the research? So we just need to make sure that, you know, that's sort of in place because we are responsible in effect because we're making it public. And then we'll manage the access to those data. If we've agreed an embargo period of a year or whatever, we'll make sure that's in place. We'll make sure it's lifted after a year. If you want it lifted before then for whatever reason, that's absolutely fine as well. As I say, it's fine to issue a DOI with embargo on the data because the data's been handed to a data center. There is a publication record to say that this is going to be published in the future at a certain date, and that is completely acceptable within freedom of information, environmental information regulations in the UK, and also within the framework of DOIs as well. So we'll do all that side of it. We'll set up the access and the download, and we'll set up whatever access arrangements we've agreed in advance. So one of the things I wanted to just quickly show you the mechanism for how it works with the DOI. Very familiar to you, I guess, no different than a journal paper that's been given a DOI. Essentially what happens is that you'll reference your data set in a paper, in a journal paper. It will be referenced at the bottom like you would any citation. And that citation, that URL for the DOI, once you just put that into a browser and click on it, it takes you absolutely automatically to the catalogue record, and that's an absolute guarantee that that record or that page, that web page will work. One of the requirements upon us as a data center that can issue DOIs is that we absolutely have to guarantee that what's called the landing page, the catalogue information about the data set, is always available, regardless of whether we change the server name or change our website name. We have to make sure it always works in the future. So it guarantees whoever's putting that URL into the browser that it comes up with the information. Of course, that includes the important information about what the data set is, who the authors were, whether it's available now, whether or not you have to wait to access it, what the terms and conditions are over the access to those data, and also, you know, links to other detailed descriptions so people can read a bit more about it before deciding whether to download it, and to other links to maybe the ESPR program so they can see the wider context of this data set, or indeed find out about other data sets that are either stored in EIDC or with UKDS or anywhere else that are associated with the ESPA program, which we'll come onto a slide where we'll talk about how we link all these things together. So that's how the DOI works, and as I say, the main benefit of this is that it's guaranteed persistence into the future. So as we were saying, it's a way of promoting the science you've been involved in, the effort you've put into generating that data. We also make those catalogue records widely accessible. So if you search for our catalogue, find the catalogue record, but you can search for it in any number of places and find the same information. It always leads back to the same original record, the same information in that original record in our catalogue. So it doesn't really matter if, where you search for it, you always get the same information. So the NERC catalogue will contain the information that we provide on that catalogue record. The data.gov in the UK run a similar catalogue which harvests the information from all the other public catalogues. So it appears in there, so the UK policymakers can find it quite easily in there. We also push it up to the European portal, so it's more widely made aware. And also, if you just Google it, we expose the records to web search engines as well. So it's a very, you can see from that it's a very, very easily discoverable resource or asset that helps to promote your outputs. So Veerle is just going to talk about the way that UKDS catalogue their data.
In the case of UKDS, we make those data sets discoverable through our own portal called Discover. Obviously, through the DOIs, data sets are also discoverable via their publications, etc. Now, the main thing to say about ESPA is obviously that it's a cross-disciplinary research program. It covers the social and the environmental sciences, hence the collaboration here between EIDC and us. And important for you to know is that we will be providing maximum, or we are already providing maximum linkages between the data centers, between other places where you have publications and outputs, so that researchers interested in ESPA, its outputs, its data, can easily find all these resources, even if they might be distributed over different data centers. Each of our data sets will have related resources that can link to the other places where other outputs are kept. So even if some of your data are deposited with EIDC and your social sensitive data might be deposited with the UK Data Service, we'll make sure that there's very clear linkage between those data collections so that it's very clear to the users that these belong together. And also linkage then with the ESPA website where these resources are also promoted. Here, for example, an example of those linkages. So this is an ESPA dataset we already have at the moment in the UK Data Service. We have various ones already. This is just one example. So the catalogue record in the UK Data Service links to other data collections in the related resources, also housed in UKDS as it is, but even if that is deposited elsewhere, we will simply link to it because it's just linked to the DOI. We link to publications. In this case, there is one working paper that is deposited with ESPA, published by ESPA, and there is a data paper published in Scientific Data. Again, through the DOI or the URL, we link to those resources so they can easily be accessed. There's a website that you can link to, whether it's your project website. In this case, it links to the records for the project on the RC UK, the Research Council's Gateway to Research, where obviously as a grant holder, you submit all your outputs, your impact statements, your publications through ResearchFish. So automatically we link to the gateway so that users can easily find all your publications and outputs on there. And then finally, through your ORCID ID, which hopefully as a researcher you all have, we push the metadata to DataSite, and if you enable it in your ORCID profile, then your data sets just like other publications, will be picked up from DataSite and will be harvested into your ORCID profile. So it all sits together there, publications, datasets, any outputs. Data papers. This is a new type of publication that has been coming along in the last few years. And the idea of a data paper is that you describe your data collection, your data set, how it was created, what you think is the value, what you think is the reuse value for future. So it complements other papers that you write which will describe the findings of your research. This one focuses specifically on your data set. Scientific data from the Nature Publishing Group is an example of a data journal, and both EIDC and UKDS are recommended repositories for this particular data journal. In our case, it's again to enable data sets that require certain restrictions or certain access controls that we can host to also be described in data papers, because a lot of other repositories would expect data to be open access. A lot of data journals would also expect them to be open access. So we can specifically provide those access controls. Again, the DOIs link the data sets to the data paper, and it's especially good for the data people, the data scientists, the data managers in your team to also be able to get their own publications. Again, this is an example from ESPA. The data set is hosted by us and the descriptor is published in Scientific Data.
Okay, so hopefully that's giving you quite a lot of information around the benefits, of depositing data and making it more widely shareable, some of the mechanisms of how to go about doing that, and some of the background to that. So in terms of next steps, in terms of practical next steps, the simplest starting point, is literally to make a list of the data sets you think are of long-term value, even if you're not a little bit sure of whether they are or not. Just list them out. Ideally as well with a little bit of, maybe a sentence that literally just describes what they are, and perhaps the volume size of them as well. I can see one of the questions is around volume of data. And that's useful information as a starting point, and it helps us to work with you to try and identify which ones are of long-term value and what we can do. So really for each one, you may have an idea of where you think it should go, whether it should come to EIDC or UKDS, or if it's kind of genomic data, whether it should go to one of the other specialist repositories. And then to contact either EIDC or UKDS, either through a named contact if you've got that already, or the two email addresses that are given there, and then we'll take it from there and decide what we think is the best approach from there.